The tool room had no grand name. It occupied a corner of the main workshop behind a low partition of pine planks, and from the outside it looked like any other cluttered bench, racks of metal, a few lamps burning lower than elsewhere, the smell of cutting oil soaking into the grain of the wood. But what lived on those racks was the reason the whole floor ran. Cutters, taps, dies, gauges. The shop now made its own, in its own hands, by its own measure. That was the thing I had been building toward without always knowing it. Not the lathe, not the forge, not even the master plates. This. The capacity to replace what wore out, to make what was needed, to never again stand at a machine with a broken cutter and no way to cut another. I said it plainly to whoever would listen, and I meant it plainly. The court can blockade the roads tomorrow, and it changes nothing. You can't strangle a thing that makes its own hands. It was not bravado, it was a process statement. The supply lines that could be cut were the ones that ran inward, the ones that depended on someone else's goodwill, someone else's warehouse, someone else's decision to open or close a gate. We had severed those dependencies one by one, and the tool room was the last and most important severance. A shop that could not make its own cutters was a shop that could be starved. We were no longer that shop. The racks told the story better than I could. Twist drills in graduated sizes, each one ground to angle on the bench grinder we had built from salvaged wheel iron and a dressed sandstone wheel. Taps and their matching dies, cut on the lead screw lathe, the thread flanks chased and checked against the master thread gauge until the fit was what it needed to be. Not close, not acceptable, correct. Plug gauges and ring gauges, hardened and lapped, each one numbered and entered in Seo-rin's record book. Go and no-go, every critical dimension in the shop, doubled in metal, so that any worker at any bench could check their own work without asking permission. The racks were not decorative. They were the skeleton of the operation, and the operation stood on them. Mok Jae stood at the center of it. I had watched the change happen gradually enough that I almost missed the moment it completed. He had come to us as an apprentice who learned fast and kept his head down, the kind of young man who absorbed a method once and never needed to be told twice. Somewhere in the months of work, the scraping sessions, the gauge making, the hours at the lead screw cutting threads that had to be right because everything downstream depended on them, he had crossed a line that most craftsmen never find. He had stopped being a man who made things and become a man who made the things that made things. The distinction sounds small. It is not small. He was at the bench when the forge team's lead hand came to him with a problem, an indexing fixture that needed to locate to 4 positions exactly, no drift, no slop, no prayer that the pin had seated fully. Mok Jae listened without interrupting. He turned the half-finished fixture in his hands, ran a thumbnail across the locating board, set it down. You needed to index to 4 positions exactly, he said. Give me till morning. I'll make you the thing that makes it easy. Not the thing that makes it easy. That was the distinction, and he had learned it so thoroughly, he no longer noticed he was making it. The most respected man on the floor, I thought, watching him reach for stock, and he doesn't even know it, the best kind. The school had grown the same way the toolroom had, not by announcement, not by decree, but by the pressure of need accumulating until the structure appeared to contain it. Seo-rin had started with a handful of workers who needed to read a gauge or copy a number without error. She had a full room now, and the room was never empty. The refugees had come in waves through the autumn and into the winter. People the empire had finished with, people whose towns had gone dark when their mandate anchor failed and the veil thinned to nothing. They arrived with their hands and their hunger and in most cases nothing else. The old order had no use for them. The old order had in fact never had use for most of them. It had used them, which is a different thing entirely. Seo-rin stood at the front of the room with a slate board and a patience that I had come to recognize as a form of precision. She was as careful with a student's confusion as she was with a measurement, treating both as problems that had solutions if you looked at them correctly. The mandate never had a place for you, she told them, and she said it without softness, because softness would have been condescension. This does. Learn the number, and the number doesn't care where you were born. It was the truest thing anyone said in that building, and she said it every time a new face appeared in the doorway. I heard it often enough that I stopped hearing the words and started hearing what was underneath them. A standard. Not a kindness, not a charity, not a gift from the fortunate to the unfortunate. A standard, applied without exception. The gauge does not care about your family name. The flat plate does not care which village you came from. The thread either fits or it does not, and the fitting is something you can learn. People learned. The envoys came on a gray morning when the frost had not yet lifted from the yard. Two of them, older men, wearing the kind of travel-worn clothing that meant a long road and not much choice about taking it. They stood at the workshop entrance with the careful stillness of people who were not sure of their welcome. I had been told they were coming. I had not been told how diminished they would look, not physically, though the road had been hard, but in the particular way of people who have watched the thing they depended on fail and have not yet found what to depend on instead. Their anchor had died at midwinter. That was how they said it. Died. The mandate anchor for their town, the source of whatever thin veil had held the dark back from their streets, had simply stopped. No warning, no gradual dimming, or perhaps there had been warning and they had not known how to read it. Either way, the result was the same. Dark and cold, and the slow dispersal of everyone who could leave. The elder who spoke for them was direct. He had, I thought, decided on the road that there was no time left for anything but directness. Our anchor died at midwinter, he said. You held the dark with iron, not prayer. We have nothing but our hands. Teach us what you did. The room was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that means people are thinking rather than waiting. The thinking led to the argument, and the argument was the one that mattered most. I had known it would come eventually. I had thought about it myself, in the way you think about a problem you know is coming and cannot yet solve. Ji Wol-yeong brought it into the open in the evening, when the envoys had been fed and housed, and the core group had gathered in the small room off the main workshop that served as a meeting space. She had the warden's habit of saying difficult things without apology, not because she was unkind, but because she had learned that apology blurred the edges of a problem. Give it away, she said, and in 10 years we're not the only ones with steel and guns. She was not wrong. That was the weight of it. She was not wrong, and she knew I knew she was not wrong, and she was putting it plainly because plainly was the only way to put it. I thought about it for a moment, not long. The answer had been forming for a while, in the back of the process, and it came out the way answers do when they've been worked properly. Give it away, I said, and in 10 years the whole frontier is alive, instead of dark. Knowledge hoarded is just another crown. We didn't come this far to build a smaller court. Ji held my gaze for a moment, then she nodded, once, the way she nodded when she had tested a position and found it sound. She did not agree easily. That was why her agreement meant something. The wagon was loaded the next morning. Tools first, the ones we could spare, which was more than it had been 6 months ago, because the tool room now produced faster than the shop consumed. A set of taps and dies, a set of plug gauges, go and no-go, for the most common bore sizes, a small bench vise, cast and fitted here, one of the first things the foundry had turned out when the iron quality was reliable enough for it. Files, screebers, a surface plate, not a master plate, but a working plate, scraped to a standard that would serve. And a teacher. That was the part that mattered most, though the tools were necessary. You could not send the method without someone who carried it in their hands. Chae-young stood at the wagon's side as the last of the crates were loaded, talking to the man who would go south with it. She had a way of teaching that I had always found instructive to watch. She started at the bottom, always, at the thing everything else rested on, and she did not move up until the bottom was solid. Copy this master plate first, she said, and she put her hand flat on the crate that held it. Exactly. Everything stands on a flat, true thing. Start there. Same as we did. Same as we did. 3 plates scraped against each other in rotation, blue marking compound, showing the high spots, a scraper taking them down until the contact was even and the light gap closed. It had been where we started. in the cold of early winter, with the veil thin and the forge barely running. It was where they would start. The method did not change because the location changed. That was the point of having a method. Iron Ridge was not the place it had been. I noticed it in the way you notice a change that has happened gradually, all at once, and then you wonder how you missed it accumulating. The yard that had been a yard was a district. The single forge that had been a single forge was a forge and a foundry, and a machine shop, and a tool room, and a school. The population had doubled and was still growing, and the growth was not the chaotic swelling of a refugee camp, but the purposeful density of a place that had work to offer and the means to train people to do it. The place the empire wrote off had become the place everyone was walking toward. Ji Wol-yeong managed the strains of it the way she managed everything, by principle, applied without exception, which meant it was sometimes unpopular and always fair. Bread and beds by need and by work, not by who got here first, she said, when the question of priority came up, as it always came up when a place grew faster than its housing. She said it to me, but she was saying it for the record, the way she said things when she wanted them understood as policy rather than preference. We're not building the court again, Smith, not even by accident. Not even by accident. That was the hard part, not the deliberate injustice, which was easy to refuse, but the accidental one, the hierarchy that grew up without anyone deciding to grow it, because the people who arrived first had more experience, and the people who arrived later had less, and the gap compounded if you didn't watch it. G watched it. That was her work, and she did it with the same precision Seo-rin brought to a measurement. Do-kwang had lost 2 fingers on his left hand in the accident 3 months back, and Tal had lost the use of his right arm below the elbow in the mine collapse the winter before that. Neither of them could work a crank or swing a hammer with the force the production floor required. Both of them knew everything. That, it turned out, was the more valuable thing. They taught. Do-kwang ran the morning instruction for the new arrivals, the safety procedures first, always first, because the floor was dangerous and ignorance was the most dangerous thing on it. Tal sat at a bench and demonstrated, one-handed, the techniques that looked impossible until you understood the principle behind them, at which point they looked obvious. Do-kwang had a way of putting it that I had heard him use more than once, and it was right every time he used it. The hammer's the cheap part, he said, to a row of new faces watching him, with the careful attention of people who understood they were learning something they would need. What's in our heads they can never blockade or burn. Teach it to 10 more, and you've made yourself impossible to kill. The new faces wrote it down. Seo-rin had made sure they could all write it down. That was the point. The bottleneck declared itself in the way bottlenecks always do, not as a single failure, but as a pattern of small ones, accumulating until the shape of the problem became unmistakable. Every machine on the floor wanted to run. The lathes, the drill press, the grinder, the bellows on the forge, all of them needed to be driven, and all of them were driven by muscle, cranks and treadles, and the long push-pull of men and women working levers through the hours of a shift. We had more workers than we had started with, and more machines, and the machines were better, and the work the machines could do was greater, but the ratio had not changed. Muscle in, motion out, and muscle was the thing that got tired and needed feeding and could not run through the night without cost. I stood at the center of the floor one afternoon and looked at it, really looked at it, the way you look at a system when you're trying to find where it's choking, and the answer was obvious and had been obvious for a while. I had been too close to the daily work to see it clearly. Muscle's the bottleneck now, I said. We don't need more hands on the cranks. We need to stop using hands on the cranks at all. Baek Tae-ho was beside me, running the numbers in his head the way he always did, and his face had the expression it got when the numbers confirmed something he didn't want confirmed. We can't crank our way to whatever's coming, he said. I was already looking past him, past the workshop wall, past the yard, to where the sound of moving water had been a constant background noise for so long that I had stopped registering it as a resource and had been hearing it only as sound. That's the river, Beck, I said. It never gets tired. Tomorrow we put it to work. He followed my gaze. I watched him see it, Not the water, which he had seen every day, but what the water was: force, continuous, undemanding, asking nothing in return for the work it would do. The look on his face was the look of a man revising a calculation. The river ran south, along the base of the ridge, dropping perhaps 4 spans of height over the stretch nearest the workshop. Not a great fall, but enough for a wheel of the right diameter, mounted on a shaft of the right dimension, geared to the line shaft that would run the length of the floor and drive every machine from a single source of power that did not eat, did not sleep, and did not get tired. First the river turns the wheels. That was the next step, and it was a clear step, and it was already in front of us. One day, fire and steam would do what the river did, more of it, faster, unconstrained by geography, available wherever you could burn fuel and boil water. But that was a later chapter. The method was always the same. Start with whatever's already in front of you, and build from there. The river was in front of us. Tomorrow we would begin.